America, we just witnessed a perfect example of liberal protest addiction in Minneapolis. A mob of protesters attacked federal agents conducting a legitimate drug and money laundering investigation at a Mexican restaurant, all because somebody saw an ICE badge and immediately assumed it was an immigration raid. These people are so addicted to protesting, they don't even bother to find out what's actually happening before they start protesting in the streets. Here's the kicker: when a driver tried to get through their illegal roadblock, they surrounded his car and dozens of cops had to use crowd control methods to arrest him. Meanwhile, the actual investigation had nothing to do with immigration. It was about drugs and money laundering.
We right now are waiting for more information after federal officers in tactical gear drew a large crowd of protesters happening in South Minneapolis.
Now, videos of the confrontation between those agents and demonstrators quickly went viral.
What is up, guys? Tyson De La Cruz here. Thank you so much for rocking with me. This story perfectly illustrates how liberals have turned protesting into a full-time job. They see any federal agent and immediately assume it's a human rights violation. Do these people have actual jobs, or is professional protesting their career? Let me break down what actually happened in South Minneapolis. Federal agents in tactical gear showed up at a Mexican restaurant on East Lake Street to execute a search warrant related to drugs and money laundering. This was a legitimate criminal investigation that had nothing to do with immigration.
Federal agents surrounding a Mexican restaurant in South Minneapolis this morning. The situation got out of control after a large crowd gathered and began demanding answers. They showed up after rumors spread about a possible immigration raid there, but that's not what happened.
Because some agents had ICE badges, which makes sense because ICE investigates federal crimes as well. The liberal mob immediately assumed it was an immigration raid and they started their usual tantrum. They didn't bother to ask any questions. They didn't wait for any facts. They just saw federal agents and went full resistance mode.
In fact, police say federal agents didn't even arrest anyone, though some of the video shows at least one person detained, though it doesn't mean they were arrested. They say the agents executed a search warrant as part of a criminal investigation.
Here's what's really pathetic. The agents didn't even arrest anybody. They executed a search warrant, gathered evidence, and left. But the liberal protest turned into a full-scale confrontation because they're so desperate to find something to be outraged about.
And the agents stood outside Berry area, on East Lake Street and Bloomington Avenue with guns. They also had a military-style truck outside. Protesters started seeing this around 10 o'clock this morning. Some agents had ICE badges on, and that may be where some of this confusion initially started.
The confusion started because these people see any federal law enforcement and immediately think it's some kind of oppression. They can't comprehend that maybe, just maybe, they're actual criminals who need to be investigated. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Who are these people who can show up and protest at 10 a.m. on a weekday? Do they have jobs? Are they taking vacation days to harass federal agents? Or is protesting literally their full-time occupation? Look at the timeline here. Federal agents show up around 10 a.m. to conduct a legitimate investigation. Within hours, there is a full mob of protesters blocking streets and confronting law enforcement. How do you mobilize so many people that quickly unless protesting is literally what you do for a living?
Minneapolis and state leaders say those federal agents were at a Mexican restaurant on East Lake Street and Bloomington Avenue in Minneapolis yesterday, conducting a search warrant related to drugs and money laundering, not related to immigration. But officers wearing ICE badges were spotted in some of these videos.
This is the same pattern we see in every liberal city. Professional protesters who treat every law enforcement action like it's a civil rights movement. They have a whole infrastructure set up to mobilize protesters at a moment's notice, regardless of what's actually happening.
Tensions escalated when a man drove his car through protesters who were blocking an intersection. More than a dozen police officers arrived and used crowd control methods to grab the driver.
And of course, they illegally block intersections because they think their feelings give them a right to shut down public roads. When a driver tried to get through their illegal roadblock, they surrounded his car like a mob. It took dozens of police officers using crowd control methods to arrest the driver, not the protesters who were illegally blocking the traffic. This Minnesota incident is just the latest example of a pattern we're seeing in liberal cities across America. Whether it's Seattle, Portland, San Diego, San Francisco, or Minneapolis, the response is always the same. They see federal agents, assume oppression, and start protesting. Remember the Portland protest where they attacked federal agents protecting a courthouse, or the Seattle chop zone, or the San Francisco protest where they defended business exploiting illegal workers.
The investigation centered on drugs and money laundering, but that's all we really know at this point. Deputies say they worked with the feds on the investigation and that this was just one of several search warrants they executed today throughout the metro as part of that investigation.
The common thread here is these protesters never wait for facts. They see law enforcement and immediately assume it's some kind of injustice. They're so addicted to being victims, they create victimization where none exists.
People are upset. It's wrong what's happening all over, not just here.
The way that the police are showing up in force, no wonder there's such a confrontation between them and the people that actually live here in the community. We have no reason to trust them.
Listen to this protester.
Wrong what's happening all over, not just here.
They're upset about law enforcement doing their jobs. They think investigating drugs and money laundering is wrong. The mayor actually got this one right when he said this is an example of how misinformation can spread really quickly and can get out of control and cause a lot of problems. But he's missing the bigger picture. This isn't just information, it's willful ignorance.
Yeah, Randy, Mayor Jacob Fry used this as an example of how misinformation can spread really quickly and get out of control and cause problems. And it appears that that is exactly what happened earlier this morning and into the afternoon. And
these protesters don't want facts. They want drama. They want to feel like they're part of some resistance movement. When they see federal agents, they immediately jump into the worst possible conclusion and start mobilizing their protest network. The fact that this was just one of several warrants they executed that day throughout the metro shows that this was a coordinated law enforcement operation targeting criminal activity. But the protesters turned it to some civil rights issue because that's just what they do.
Police say they just showed up to handle the crowd that gathered, and that crowd seemed to be under the impression that this was an ICE raid. The sheriff's office reiterated that although it does work with the feds on criminal investigations, as was the case here, it is not involved in any civil immigration enforcement.
Even after officials clarified that this had nothing to do with immigration enforcement, the protesters probably still think that they were fighting for some type of great injustice. They're so invested in their victim narrative that facts become absolutely irrelevant. Let's talk about the economics of these professional protests. These people can mobilize dozens of protesters on a weekday morning, block traffic for hours, and confront federal agents. Who's paying for this? In most cases, it's a combination of progressive nonprofits, active organizations, and government grants. These people are literally being paid to harass law enforcement and disrupt legitimate government operations. Meanwhile, working Americans are trying to get to their jobs and they can't because professional protesters are blocking intersections over fake ICE raids. The driver who tried to get through their roadblock probably had somewhere important to be, but the protesters think their feelings are more important than everybody else's lives. The fact that no arrests were made of these protests show how these liberal cities enable this type of behavior. They illegally block traffic, harass federal agents, and create public disturbance, but face no consequences. America, this Minneapolis incident perfectly illustrates the liberal addiction to outrage and protest. These people are so desperate to be victims that they create victimization where it doesn't even exist. Federal agents conducting a legitimate drug and money laundering investigation become oppressive ICE raids. Law enforcement doing their jobs becomes police brutality, and working Americans trying to get to work becomes secondary to the protesters' need for drama. This is what happens when you have a generation of people who've been taught that every law enforcement action is racist, every federal investigation is oppression, and every inconvenience is a human rights violation. The fact that these protesters can mobilize so quickly during work hours shows that many of them don't even have real jobs. Protesting has become their career, funded by progressive organizations that profit from chaos and division. Meanwhile, while actual criminals are running drug and money laundering operations, but the protesters are more upset about the agents investigating those crimes than they are about the crimes themselves. This is the backwards world of liberal priorities, defending criminals, attacking law enforcement, and turning every legitimate government action into a civil rights crisis. When you see these professional protesters mobilizing against federal agents, ask yourself, do these people have real jobs, or is outrage their full-time occupation? Let me know what you guys think about this. Drop it down in the comment section down below. Smash the like button if you kindly would. Share, subscribe, and as always, guys, I'll catch you on the next one.